when we asked Leotan what patient advocacy groups mean, these advocacy groups are basically advocating for rare diseases. That means two things for the debate. The first is that this is not a debate whether or not we should fund malaria or dengue or other well-known other instances, as these are not rare diseases. The second is that this debate then exists in two fronts. The first would be the incentives of a corporation and what they'll probably fund instead rather than these advocacy groups. And the second is why inherently the counterfactual is better. The second thing I'm going to characterize are the advocacy groups. Most likely these are going to be small as they are pertaining to a rare disease, and that is important for the reasons that I will illustrate later. The first thing I'm going to explain is why would corporations would invest in these advocacy groups. There are three pernicious reasons. The first is because they're going to want to gain favor, to allow close proximity to desperate patients with barely any people to go with them. They're essentially becoming slaves to the corporate decisions, as insofar they don't have leverage anymore. The second is that funding rarely goes to the patient directly. Most likely they are going to use that funding in order to use it for the test that they will conduct on the patient. And you need to note that there's going to be a lot of manufactured consent that exists here, because not only is this a rare disease, but there's also basically rare people or small people in this advocacy group. It is more likely then that they're going to coerce the individual to agree on these tests. Yes?
Breast cancer is the top 10 globally. Sickle cell disease affects 4 out of 10 infants. I don't know why we're talking about just rare diseases, guys.
Because it's literally the clarification that we said in Leotan. So it must exist in the debate. It is not our fault that you guys did not clarify. And then the third reason is that what are the sort of companies that are probably gonna fund these? We're not stopping philanthropists. We're stopping pharmaceutical companies who extort data from the individuals that then they try to get proximity to. Why is this likely to succeed even with whatever regulation they may say? There are three reasons as to why it does so. The first is that patient advocacy groups have limited leverage. Quite clearly, they're a small group because it pertains to a rare disease. In addition, corporations, especially pharmaceutical companies, has a lot of money to be able to buy out their leader and simply buy out the bureaucracy. The second is that rare diseases barely matter for a huge ton of people, and therefore there is barely any political leverage to lobby for regulation. There's any political leverage to be able to tell the government that this in fact matters and this therefore should be accounted for. The last is that even if there is regulation, it is just simply hard to prove manufactured consent and the multiple other bureaucracies that you have to go through in order to in fact say that it is illegal. It is hard for the patient to do that because they're already suffering with multiple other things, but in addition to that, manufactured consent is just inherently hard to tackle. What then should you believe from the get-go? You should believe in two things. The first is that there are already alternative forms of funding. There are already philanthropists out here who then funds these groups, and therefore we inherently believe that this funding could be used elsewhere in which are ways that are more productive. The second is that what happens on ops comparative is that individuals are vulnerable and therefore are in proximity to very exploitative actors. We also say that there is barely any benefit on their end. In fact, if they are to say then that research is inherently important and will progress further, we say that this is unlikely for two reasons. The first is that you have a small sample size. It is heavily unlikely that you're going to get anything fruitful or universal within that small sample size. Therefore, inherently the money just falls down the drain. But second, you have a limited amount of research in which you cannot inherently compound on. And if they are to say that they're going to create pre-existing research, we believe then that the ways that you're going to do it is inherently faulty by virtue of the pernicious incentives that they have. They want to maximize profit, and therefore they have multiple incentives to then circumvent the legalities, or rather the ethics of the research in the get-go. Even if you believe then that they have marginally more money, we say that it won't impact individuals as much because these fundings that are huge could rather be placed into other sectors, and we believe then that because there's a small amount of people, the money will simply just stockpile. What does this then prove? This then proves that whatever they have is just a black hole void for funding. That how much money you pour into these research will simply go down the drain, mainly because there's no merit to it. The second thing I'm going to explain is why the money will go to more productive means. Corporations would spend these on people corporations would rather spend this into diseases that has a huge huge range of impacts, such as new variations of COVID, and such as like more research into the nuances of dengue and malaria, and etc. This is good because there's already pre-existing research that like already exists, and therefore they already have a basis as to how they're going to further elaborate or nuance it. And we believe that if they don't invest these funds in advocacy groups, it is then better and more important as you can cater to a huge range of people. Why is this important, particularly in this motion? You need to realize that pharmaceuticals is a very failure-prone industry. Majority of the research and majority of their medicines do not go to the market because of a lot of nuances or a lot of chemicals involved. That is to say, or like to attest this, there is a 1/10%, or rather a 1/10 statistic that it will go to the market. Therefore, there's a 90% failure loss of millions of dollars that simply go down the drain because their drugs are ineffective. That is precisely why medicine is expensive. If you go to your local Mercury drugstore, that testament to that is already in front of you. What is important then? It is important that they use all of the funds that they're going to pour into a void to instead make their progress or make their process much more efficient by incorporating AI, as we've already seen a trend, and therefore elaborating and like knowing more ways in order to further see research and further then explore more ways to be able to make drugs that caters to different things in sickness. What does this mean then? It means two fundamental things. The first is that we're going to expand the variants of drugs and therefore make drugs more accessible for the wider majority of people. That we're going to invest it in less specific like diseases and rather would make it more nuanced to the individual needs of people. But second, there's going to be more research in drugs that is more widespread and therefore more needed. We're going to compound pre-existing research and therefore it is more safe and it is inherently better. Why is this beneficial? It is beneficial in two fronts. The first is that we are not exploiting the vulnerable actors that they're going to eventually be deceived by the side of opposition. But secondly, we are catering to a much more a plethora of people in which we've already are trying to cater to by virtue of us being pharmaceutical companies. We already say that they have other sources of funding, and therefore if funding is a problem, then we have already tackled that. Proud to propose.
Opening opposition cannot win this debate by saying they save more patients. Right now, there's a child in Africa who was born with HIV, will die in the next few months because they could not afford a vaccine. The reason why is because there's not enough research into HIV right now, because as you say, the existing alternatives that you potentially have do not extend the regional variants that would get attention on the comparative. There's a person in the developing world that cannot benefit off of Western medication because the way in which our bodies adapted mean that certain strains of things like insulin don't work on our bodies in the first place and are overfunded on their comparative under their side. So on both sides of the debate, somebody will die. But under our comparative, it deals with a larger breadth of individuals with more certainty than the research that exists under their comparative. One, I want to contest whether or not people can have access to hospice care under our comparative as well. Because what they say is at least you can get these individuals doctors. Guess what? This is not what patient advocacy groups do. Patient advocacy groups focus on the research towards developing a cure for this, hospice care, and taking care of these patients, ensuring that their final days on this earth are comfortable or outside the context of this debate. In fact, we give reasons why the research under their side is consistently likely to fail. The small sample size means that independent variables are more likely to taint research. The fact that more and more individuals have larger diseases, for example, means that also oftentimes taints with the way in which these things manifest. And you also have a limited amount of test subjects, so even if you could create some cure, it's unclear whether or not it will be comfortable enough, like most cancer patients, for example, opt out of chemotherapy. Here's the issue. The manufactured consent, the desperation that they talk about are the reasons why corporations have such strong holds over these individuals. When you fund them, you pay for their doctors in the first place, apparently. You pay for the individual cures about how these things manifest. The average life of a person in these patient advocacy groups is waking up every single day to false hope, trying to drag yourself out of bed to go to these tests because you believe that you have to do these things. Coercion by the individuals around you because funding creates leverage that patient advocacy groups, if they are so dependent on these corporations, have to follow because the board of directors has to do these things in order to apparently maintain the funding under the comparative. In fact, we explained that there are alternative sources of funding if it is true that it is that necessary. Majority of the funding that goes to these, it actually went to good places and not irresponsible research that was focused on data gathering came from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and there's massive impetus for governments like, for example, the United States, because they don't do it themselves. They use technocratic institutions that were forged in the 1980s in order to be able to do it, which are separate from the political push and pull of how these things manifest. So obviously, the research that occurs when corporate funding exists is significantly worse. It's detrimental to patients. It seeks to take their money for them, and oftentimes experimental treatments hurt patients more than they do others, and they also data gather in ways that patients cannot meaningfully consent to when they feel like it's a matter of life and death. Our counterfactual explains why the actual meaningful research in governments in places like, for example, the U.S. Department of Health, in, for example, the massive funds and donations that were created by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation are absolutely massive in being to do these things in the first place. What you should believe at this point are 3 ways in which corporations are able to coerce individuals. 1, the proximity through funding. If it is true that they are that dependent, which is already taking them at their best case, then board of directors have incentives to push these individuals. No, there are oftentimes large bridges of trust if it is true that these are small patient advocacy groups. There's peer pressure that exists to these instances. Sit down. Insofar as individual, the board of directors, how these things manifest, the people that you are close to in these advocacy groups can slowly inch you towards the idea of these things, which is why even if chemotherapy is really, really fucking painful, people still feel the pressure to be able to do it. But secondly, in the vast majority of instances, the way in which corporations frame these things, especially since these are more experimental treatments, mean that they're likely to downplay the risk over how these things manifest. And Lexi explains why regulation was insufficient. It is so difficult to manufacture and actually prove manufactured consent, which is why the prohibition is the only way to prevent these things. People opt into worse alternatives for cures that would have been available on either side of the debate. We explained that the money that corporations give are useless. Secondly, let's deal on the best case. We explained that at the very minimum, if they do give a large amount of money to these patient advocacy groups, 1, it is spread out through a vast bulk of patient advocacy groups, since as Leah Tan says, and we can feed up this because she made the motion, this is specifically for rare diseases that come by the dozen. What this means is that even if there's a large amount of money expended by these corporations, there are relatively little that these individual patient advocacy groups can benefit from. The second thing that I want to point out is that what you should evaluate now is the opportunity cost of how these things manifest. You know where there's no research? Regional strains of hepatitis, regional strains of diseases that go to these things, which we explain are obviously the next alternative if they want to expand their market base beyond just drugs and beyond just insulin and beyond just things like, for example, headache medication. What we explain right now is that the opportunity for investment is particularly important. Eli Lilly, the biggest market cap pharmaceutical company, entered a partnership into NVIDIA. Oftentimes, the smaller pharmaceutical companies have to resort to the clinical trials that they exist under their comparative. It's better that they invest that to AI development in the first place, because 90% of the money that goes into pharma disappears. Only 1 out of 10 drugs that are developed by them actually go out to the market, which is why insulin and EpiPens are so expensive. The investment into AI, if it is true that this is a massive amount of money, speeds up that process. It means that even if we speed it up by 6 months, people in those 6 months die. People in those 6 months are able to have greater access to healthcare under our comparative because AI can spot things like patterns. It can discover new molecules. It can rapidly make the protected time. It can, I guess, mandatory, yeah, sure, closing.
Look, if corporations are profit-oriented, wouldn't they have large investments in common diseases and diseases that affect the most number of people anyway?
As I explained, it is not perfect. And here's where nuance is really, really important. Maybe they have investment into hepatitis in Western strains, but these things don't work in the developing world because the opportunity cost to be able to do these things is relatively minimal. So obviously the money has to go somewhere. The next best thing is obviously the regional strains of how these things manifest, or AI integration, which we explain is significantly better under the comparative, insofar as this is massive swaths of money that you need to integrate right now, and if you wait up until the future, smaller pharmacy companies will lose out to the competition and therefore make the oligopolistic systems worse. So if it's a way up about which sorts of diseases that you need, we explain explain why research is more likely to exist and become successful in opening government. Because you have pre-existing strains that you can model after these diseases. Because greater investment into AI creates exponential effects in the way in which you're able to manufacture drugs. They will always have to take a trade-off under their comparative, always have to take a delay in being able to have AI integration because they're using so much of this money under their comparative, which is that millions die under their watch and nobody died, or significantly less died on opening government. Very, very proud of the report.
The reason why the African child would die of HIV, as said by Sam, is because it's considered a rare disease. That it's so rare for you to get HIV. You don't need the specific funding. All of the examples coming from opening government is whack, and we will kill them in their case. The first thing I want to respond to is their case that, well, corporations will likely abuse the funding, they'll likely do things like experimental treatments, etc. One, this is debating another motion. Two, they don't explain why their incentives are more important than the incentives as explained coming from Alyssa. And here's where I want to win. First, you lose more profit insofar as you try to abuse the patients in and out of themselves. Given that it is rare diseases that have rare solutions and harder cures, means that you have to significantly invest a lot more into the different types of experiments that you have to do on a day-to-day basis, which the board of directors do not presumably want to push forward, because they lose a lot of that money into investing into for instance, their corporation's product instead, which is why they're unlikely going to abuse this power, because they would lose profit in return. But the second thing here is that, given that it's a long process to be able to get cures for these types of diseases, means that they need to make sure that it's stable in this aspect. Sit down. What this means is that they would want to make sure that the process of it is good in and out of themselves, so that number one, they are able to continue their treatments there. Like if their patient dies, obviously there's going to be a huge scandal effect to which the people won't necessarily try to buy into that company, or a lot of people now start calling this company out to the point of bailout, because things like stock prices will therefore decrease once they see this corporation actively killing patients on the ground, which is why they're unlikely going to do it. But the second thing here is that they don't directly link why research or the funding of these advocacy groups would automatically lead to experimental treatments. And this is why they do not engage with the frame coming from Alyssa. What we explain is that these patient advocacy groups are a whole variety of them. Sure, some of them might go into research, but often these are formed from communitarial basis. They're often formed when people or family members have patients in hospitals and therefore need, for instance, platforms to be able to bring awareness so that other individuals do not need to go through the same experience that they needed. And this was crucial because this is the prerequisite for them to be able to get those things understood in the first place, for them to be able to understand that there are diseases that are happening right now, they are suffering in their deathbeds, and therefore need that specific type of treatment. And that is the most important aspect in this debate, because their comparative is common diseases already that do have significant amounts of funding already, as explained. I'll take note of that later. But the second thing here is that this explains that this is the only alternative that people can opt into. Sam never responds to the second argument coming from Alyssa, which is why it still stands at the end of this debate. All of these reasons suggest that, number one, the corporations would unlikely abuse it in that specific aspect. But the second thing here is that even if they do abuse it, like for instance they steal your data, or for instance engage in bad treatments, we're willing to take this trade-off. Why? For two reasons. First, it gives people hope at the end of the day. Even if it is false hope, at least people are happy on their deathbeds, knowing that they at least tried, knowing that they're at least able to have a fighting chance. But the second thing here is that it continues more further development in the future. What experiments you need to do, you shouldn't do. What treatments you shouldn't do, and the different types of symptoms that these patients experience, which involves more research in the future. So even if a small sample size is a problem right now, that is why research exists, because you accumulate those sample sizes as you further do those experiments down the line, which is why research becomes more important. And here's why I want to weigh the incentive of corporations and why they're likely going to be good, because they lock it at the deadlock of corporations bad. I will weigh these incentives. One, it's a long-term incentive for them to be able to establish a benevolent optics for a lot of people to opt into it. Like for instance, family members of those diseases. Once they see, for instance, that the corporation helped you, they're more likely going to opt into you, buy your products, and etc. Which is why they're willing to stay this long-term aspect. Versus on their side of the house, if they fail right now, like investors won't likely invest into it because they'll see it as risky, they'll see it the corporation failing, and therefore won't necessarily give their money. But the second thing here is that you will easily get called out by the people. Why? Because oftentimes if you get a scandal case, obviously that affects not just your optics, but your ability to do future connections in the future, which is why businesses do not want to go under that risk of, for instance, abusing their powers, or for instance, making sure that this experiment is bad, which is why it's likely going to be good. Before I go on, Sam.
The only leg opening opposition stands on is this op6 point, which is absolutely fucking crazy. You know why? Because pharmaceuticals are an inelastic good, which means regardless of how bad they look, the market cap and this inelastic good means that people will still buy their products.
No. Number one, they just don't respond to the profit thing. The second thing is that even if it's inelastic, there are different corporations that exist, which is why competition still exists with the different pharmaceutical companies that exist, which is why they're unlikely going to be bad aspects, which is why, for instance, if you like give a fake scam like Trajano's, obviously people will call it out and people won't update to it necessarily. The second thing I want to respond to is why the comparative doesn't work. And here's why I want to engage onto that. Because their comparative is you get to invest into common researches, etc. I think it's probably called out coming from Alex. I think this is just inexclusive. But here's why I want to engage more onto them. The first is that their exclusive mechanism comes late at sound, which is to say that there's an opportunity cost and there's regional variance as well. You know what are regional variants of, for instance, HIV? Those are fucking rare, right? So it means that they're crossing their side of the house. But the second thing here is that if their mechanism about why their comparative exclusive is about data, then obviously these corporations would have invested into these companies anyways because there's a bigger sample size on our side of the house as well. So this comparative is inexclusive at the end of this debate. But the third and last thing here is that this is a tool in the toolbox. What's missing from opening government is why a majority of these corporations would invest into these rare diseases. We explained because there are a lot of plethora of companies that already exist because the market for instance, research into diseases is so huge. It means that there are other companies that are still willing to invest into the comparative opening government, but at least there are still companies that can invest into rare diseases, which means that there's at least able to be funding on their side of the house. So insofar as engaging on their frame, they don't explain why the majority of corporations would likely abuse this, nor take away funding from these rare diseases, from these common diseases. What we explain is that at least we're able to get that funding at our side of the house. Let's then explain then why will these Stop. Let's explain then why these individuals have the power over, for instance, controlling where the money goes and etc. The first is that it's the narrative, right? It's, for instance, them able to call out and specifically say what's happening in their negotiations. And obviously, if they'd be like, a corporation is abusing us, and you can like literally stop it, right? Like you're a patient advocacy group, you can choose what corporations that you want to invest into and what money you want to take from them. But the second thing here is that oftentimes, given that these researchers diseases are very hard to cure, the corporations investing into it are probably family members that experience it, are probably people that are empathetic towards these individuals because they recognize, even if it's rare, they knew it was a rare disease because they actively experienced it themselves, they actively saw their family members, which is why they want to invest it in the last year scenario. The last thing I want to say here is that these individuals are desperate. These are people that have no treatment at all coming from government side of the house. If they do not have a corporation funding them or backing them up, they will likely go into riskier decisions. They will likely go into pernicious actions when they see their infant dying with no money, dying with no cures, and etc. Which is why on government side of the house, they go to people like loan sharks to be able to get money. They go to people like bad doctors or shady doctors because any chance of them being able to uplift you is something that you take because they're proximate towards your lives. Versus on our side of the house, at least it's safe and stable because it's a process in which the corporations already do it, which allows you to remain safe on the ground. Very proud to oppose.
The reason why we will win over OG is because we will bite the bullet. Largely, these are probably not going to be rare diseases because as Theo is right, oftentimes the largest advocacy groups are probably groups that have the most amount of people that they often help at the very end of the day. But even if they want to keep using Leah Tan's clarification, I want to note that she used that clarification as an example. It's not a broad assessment on how the motion ought to go. This is one instance. So because they narrow themselves into the scope, means that they're largely out of the debate. The first thing I want to explain quite clearly is that private donations will always exist. If OO is right and that there are people who are well-intentioned, probably they're still going to donate and they're still going to do so in private names by themselves, not necessarily tying their corporations in it at the very end of the day. Actually, most of the status quo investments come from this manner. It's not because of large corporations anyway, so it's unclear why it has to be through corporations at the very end of the day. So we have to assume that these are corporations with an intention to be a part of the advocacy group, to have some intention, ill intention, to manipulate the advocacy group at the very end of the day. Because rationally speaking, the average businessman is not going to risk his entire corporation just because his dad died from cancer or something like that. He will probably just do so privately, which means that, second, the corporations that are likely to invest in these advocacy groups are probably corporations who are part of big pharma. Corporations have the interest to manipulate what the advocacy group actually fights for at the very end of the day. And this is why CG is going to win quite clearly. It's because it's not about rare diseases or research. And I have a very funny opportunity to break the deadlock that happens in opening half now. What exactly is the motion about? Because I don't think it's about research for a couple of key reasons. First, it's because we never burden grassroots to solve things in the first place. We don't burden the BLM, like the Black Lives Matter movement, to solve like black housing and the like. We don't burden the feminist movement in order to make sure all women in Africa are happy or something like that. Oftentimes, these advocacy groups are able to do things like challenge these systems or challenge the large corporations that have some oppressive mechanism over people on the ground. And largely, the reason for this is because oftentimes research doesn't actually come from grassroots movement. The research comes from private clinics. It comes from large corporations who have the legal incentive and the legal requirement to publish their research and to publish their finding anyways. So at the opening half is a deadlock because research is gonna happen on either side of the house. Then I guess the debate overall is not necessarily about research. It's about the way in which we're able to advocate for the instances where individuals are unable to access medical care at the very end of the day as well. So what is the purpose of like grassroots and advocacy groups at the very end of the day? We think at CG, we will clarify that it's about things like channeling anger and resentment that people have, that people have been failed by traditional medicine systems in order to productive criticism that are able to challenge large structures that force them to pay thousands of dollars in order to access maintenance meds, in order to force them to like access thousands of dollars of chemotherapy and the like. Go.
Yeah, but it was the anger of so many lung cancer patients that pushed Philip Morris and several tobacco companies to invest millions in patient advocacy groups.
I will deal with that in the rest of the argument. Okay, the second layer of this argument is to explain that corporate interference makes patient advocacy groups less likely to advocate for controversial things. And this is what's going to deal with CEO at the very end of the day. Because I want to note that things like cancer, things like diabetes are very uncontroversial, right? So if you want to talk about things like a mother unable to live the rest of their life with their child because they have cancer, it probably means that on either side of the house, people are still going to have some modicum of sympathy for the mother. So the mother is still probably going to get investments from LGUs or from GoFundMe's and the like. So what the advocacy group does quite rarely is they're able to take things with a lot of nuance, like the policies that large corporations have and question these things, like the way in which they price the medicine and the way in which they have the process in which they make the medicine and why it's so expensive. Why exactly are they able to do this? It's because they have things like a network of doctors, a network of officials that are able to question these things and rationalize these things to the broader public that the average person cannot understand. The average person can understand that diabetes is bad, but they cannot understand why policies are the way they are, which is why the advocacy group has to remain untouched by large corporations with ill intentions, because these are the only groups that can explain it and rationalize it to the people. So in order to access any of the investment benefits that CEO explains, then we have to rationalize that we have to believe that these advocacy groups have the capacity to rationalize these things in the first place. But I want to note that this is important because even if OP is able to co-opt some capacity for social critique in the system, the margin and the way that you're able to co-opt this is quite small, because these are probably going to be things that are very uncontroversial, things that are very simple for people to understand. So the most crucial things and the things that affect the broader public, because it's written in the fine lines and the bylaws, remain untouched and remain untouched at the very end of the day as well. Why is it crucial that we deprioritize the way in which they receive social critique over ours? There are a couple of key reasons. The first is because there's a bipartisan incentive to resolve these things anyways. It is very hard to say that, oh my god, cancer is a Republican agenda or a liberal agenda and the like, but it's also a lot easier for corporations to wash and politicize the things that we want to resolve under their side of the house at the very end of the day. The second reason is because it's a lot easier to gain critical mass over these broad discussions at the very end of the day as well. So over all these broad discussions as well. The second argument that I want to explain, I won't make a BY anymore with it. The second argument that I want to explain is why uniquely patient groups, patient advocacy groups, ought to serve as the counter-check to corporations. There are a couple of reasons why this is the case, but most largely and most crucially is because oftentimes these are the groups with the largest credibility to access and to talk about these sorts of critique, right? So yeah, maybe one person or two people are going to talk about the price of diabetes medicine, but it's not enough to rationalize why it should be cheaper, because often, again, these things are written in the fine lines. On our side of the house, you have a network of individuals that are they're able to channel their anger. You have a network of doctors who are able to rationalize these things, which means that they're uniquely the only group that is able to actually rationalize these things out at the very end of the day. But there are also a couple of reasons why corporation funding is unable for you to access these things. First, it's because oftentimes contracts exist for funding, which means that we will fund you X amount of money and then you cannot say XYZ things about us. Large pharmaceutical companies probably have the incentive to do these things. The second is because even if we do not believe this, it's that the nature of the advocacy group is probably going to shift. They're much more hesitant to question the source of money that they receive their resources from at the very end of the day. But all of these things is, even if you do not believe all these things, it's just that corporations have a lot easier time to wash off all of the negative claims that the vast majority of people can assert, because they can simply say that they're just funding these advocacy groups. For all these reasons and more, CG proceeds. Thanks.
You know what? I'm not gonna say that this debate is deadlocked. This debate is just wrong. The problem with all other teams in this debate is they never characterize what the difference of an advocacy group is from every other health entity. Because note, in the opening half, they made them such that these advocacy groups were suddenly going to be magically the ones heading this research, which is also the pitfall that Theo falls into. That for some reason, they were in charge of being able to pick and choose the direction of where you do research and the like. And this is important because the nuance that Kim gives you is specifically the roles of these advocacy groups and what they specifically fight for. We explained that what they necessarily do is do things like to some extent lobbying and recommending things like policy direction. That what they often do is do things like other corporations aren't willing to do for people, which is, for example, give paralegal advice so people who are wronged by the medical system can do things like sue, can do things like stand up to these systems. And this is important because we are the only team to discuss what the process of advocacy actually looks like. Because if you look at the ping pong that happened coming from opening half, it was essentially they're going to do it bad, but then just says that they have reasons naman to do it well to some extent. And this is the problem, because this wasn't about things that are uncontroversial. Because if these were things that were uncontroversial, things that delivered universal good, precisely for the reasons that Bench says, then these are things that are going to be funded privately, that are going to be funded by people that have incentives to make profits. So maybe it is true that they stand to gain a profit from investing in restraints, then that is exactly why it will happen on either side of the house. So the difference now is what these specifically the role of advocacy groups do, where they fit into this bunch of moving parts and all these kinds of things, which is precisely why we are ahead at this point. The first thing that I want to do is just situate our extension relative to the debate, because I understand that it kind of gives off 3 or 0. The important thing here is that if you notice the opening gov case, it's really largely uncomparative, because it's kind of trying to say that, if we don't have funding from private corporations, then magically we can solve things like regional diseases. That suddenly we can do these strains and all these kinds of things. This is not a knife, because what you were able to demonstrate coming from Kim is the process by which you actually get there. The premise that we were able to prove was that, and the important contingency that we were able to prove, was that the money that you get from corporations fundamentally shifts the priorities of advocacy groups. And this is the premise that proves all those claims. Because for you to believe that less money will suddenly go to more important causes, you first have to believe that you remove the influence caused by the money that inflows within these advocacy groups. And we are fundamentally able to prove that. So the way we were able to basically enter the debate, right? Because at this point the alternatives that they talk about aren't really mutually exclusive, and all kind of does a good job at pointing this out, is that we were able to fill the gap. We proved that funding shifts the priorities of these corporations, which is why you get all the myriad of harms that they talk about. So generally, at this point, we're just more realistic and ahead in terms of the vertical. The next thing that I want to talk about is just opposition in general, right? The first thing that they say is that they give a lot of reasons for corporations as to why they will not be abusive, they will somewhat be good naman, and they will try to, do all these things. The problem is, if this is true and they stand to make a lot of profit from it, why not private funding? So this debate isn't about that section of corporations, right, that stand to gain profits from rare diseases, that stand to be able to do research well and
do it in-house. Because these are the corporations that would not invest in these things. So what is a specific demographic of corporations that invest in these things? And you know what? This speech was kind of unclear initially from my notes because I wasn't able to think of example. But thank you, Alex, for giving me an example. It is companies like Philip Morris who can now pacify long advocacy groups, right? They do things like, this is precisely why those groups are, for example, suddenly silent on the effects of vapes. Because even if you're able to deal with the problem of cigarettes, it's the fact that they were able to pacify these groups to start talking about these things less. Or the fact that they can fund research that muddies the consensus on how bad cigarettes are. We're not saying that they're able to completely flip the narrative, right? Because that's unrealistic. We're quite realistic actually as CG. But it's the fact that you muddy the discussions on these things. You make it harder for politicians to write legislation on these things because you make the research muddy and because they're able to shift the direction ever so slightly away from talking about these things, right? And this is important because even if you don't believe it's like pernicious companies like Philip Morris, it's the fact that breast cancer advocacy groups, for example, are now pivot, even if they have slightly more money, are now pivoted to talking about things like infographics and self-diagnosis instead of, for example, lobbying to increase the access to things like mammograms, because hospitals and pharmaceutical companies don't stand to profit from making things more accessible and cheap. And this is important because this means that we were fundamentally the only team to be able to make the trade-off. Even if we get slightly less money under our side, the direction towards where that money is spent is proven to be far better because it's no longer spent towards things that are largely just neutral and largely just passive, things that don't target corporations specifically. But secondly, we were able to weigh this off quite well, that on either side of the house, the things that will make corporations money, the things that will benefit them either way, will be done for the same reasons that OFF identifies. The reason and the role of advocacy groups is to advocate for the things that no one else is advocating for in the medical space. Things like being able to sue hospitals for malpractice, things like being able to advocate for things that might not necessarily be profitable towards corporations. Before I continue opening.
This extension falls because it assumes advocacy groups have a platform and power which knives opening government, and if corporations are so bad, they'd still overprice stuff like insulin and gum.
So if they have no power, then what is your delta? The problem is, if you just keep shrinking their size, then just nobody has any delta in the debate. So you have to assume that they have some amount of power. But again, the second way that we weigh this off is independent as to whether or not they have power. Because even if they are, only have like a 1% success rate at suing hospitals, that's better than nobody even trying to sue hospitals in the first place, or nobody trying to hold hospitals accountable either way. So at the end of this, what do you get? Largely, this opposition team has been incredibly defensive. Because if you look at a lot of their argumentation, it's just a bunch of like spam of mechanisms as to why this will be done well or why the process won't be so bad naman. What we were able to specifically prove is two things. The first is that two things that you have to take away from CG, from CG, which explain why we advance. The first is we prove specifically what the role of advocacy groups are. That they aren't just a substitute for research companies. That they are just going to do the same roles that pharma companies do. They set direction. They have like associations of doctors that make recommendations, and often their opinions are largely valid when it comes to the creation of regulations and things like laws. But the second thing that we demonstrate is that their role fundamentally, even if they have less money, is to be diametrically opposed to these corporations in order to hold them accountable. These are things that happen regardless of their size, regardless as to whether or not they're pernicious with data, and regardless of whether or not the process will be done well or not. For all these reasons, you have to affirm.